The moment Clara Whitmore stepped off that dusty train in Silver Creek, Colorado, Gerald Harrington took one look at her and laughed a cruel cutting sound that echoed through the depot. "You're not what I ordered," he sneered, turning his back on the woman who'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry him. But before Clara's tears could fall, a voice like rolling thunder cut through the crowd. "Then you're a fool, Harrington." Every head turned to see Kieran Holt, the most feared rancher in 3 counties, his eyes locked on Clara with an intensity that would change everything. Friends, if you want to know how a rejected mail-order bride became the most envied woman in the West, stay with me till the end of this incredible story, and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these tales travel. The train's whistle had barely faded into the Colorado mountains when Clara Whitmore found herself standing on the wooden platform of Silver Creek Station, her entire world contained in 2 worn leather cases and a heart full of hope that was about to be shattered into 1,000 pieces. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty street, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that should have been beautiful, but instead felt like a mockery of the dreams she'd carried across half a continent. She had memorized Gerald Harrington's letters during the long journey from Boston, every promise, every sweet word, every description of the life they would build together on his prosperous ranch. Her fingers still bore the ink stains from writing her own replies, carefully crafted messages that revealed just enough of her character to intrigue but not so much as to seem forward. It had been a delicate dance conducted through paper and pen, one that had led her to abandon everything familiar for the promise of love and a new beginning in the untamed West. The platform was crowded with the usual collection of frontier folk, weathered ranchers collecting supplies, women in calico dresses, shepherding children, Chinese laborers from the railroad camps, and the ever-present collection of drifters and gamblers that seemed to accumulate in every western town like dust in corners. Clara stood out among them like a rose in a field of sagebrush, her traveling dress of deep blue wool still bearing the careful tailoring of Eastern fashion, though now wrinkled from days of train travel. "Miss Whitmore." The voice was thin and reedy, nothing like what she had imagined from the bold handwriting of those letters. Clara turned to find a man approaching her, and her heart sank even as she forced a smile. Gerald Harrington was shorter than she had pictured, with narrow shoulders and a face that seemed pinched in permanent disapproval. His clothes were expensive, she could tell that much from the quality of the fabric, but they hung on him awkwardly as if he was a boy playing dress-up in his father's wardrobe. "Mr. Harrington," she said, dropping into a small curtsy as was proper. "I'm so pleased to finally—" "Let me see you," he interrupted, circling her slowly, like a buyer examining livestock at auction. His pale eyes traveled from her auburn hair pinned up beneath her traveling hat, down to her dusty boots, and back up again. The inspection was cold, clinical, and utterly devoid of the warmth she had felt in his letters. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she held her position chin raised with what dignity she could muster. Around them she could feel the eyes of the townspeople, their curiosity naked and unashamed. This was entertainment for them. She realized the arrival of another mail-order bride, another desperate woman who had gambled everything on promises written in ink. "You're older than I expected," Gerald said flatly, stopping in front of her. "Your photograph was misleading." "The photograph was taken just 6 months ago," Claire replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I'm 27 exactly as I stated in my letters." 27, he repeated as if the number itself was an insult. "And you've obviously been traveling rough. Your dress is wrinkled, your complexion is weathered." Clara's hands tightened on the handles of her cases. "Mr. Harrington, I've been on a train for 5 days. Perhaps if we could retire somewhere private to discuss—" "There's nothing to discuss." The words cut through the air like a blade. Gerald stepped back, brushing invisible dust from his jacket. "You're not what I ordered. The arrangement is canceled." The platform seemed to tilt beneath Clara's feet. "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me clearly enough. You're not suitable. I have a reputation to maintain in this town, and I won't have it said that Gerald Harrington settled for—" He gestured vaguely at her, "inferior goods." The crowd that had been pretending not to watch gave up all pretense now. Clara could hear the whispers spreading like wildfire through the gathered townspeople. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, but beneath that was a rising tide of anger. Inferior goods, she repeated, her voice gaining strength. Sir, I am not a shipment of dry goods or a mail-order catalog item. I am a woman who traveled 2,000 miles on the strength of your promises, your declarations of affection and commitment. I sold everything I owned, left behind what little family I had, all because you— Spare me the melodrama. Gerald cut her off with a dismissive wave. You knew this was a business arrangement. I was quite clear about my expectations, and you've failed to meet them. I'll reimburse you for half your train fare. That's more than generous under the circumstances. He pulled out a thin wallet and began counting bills with theatrical precision. The crowd pressed closer, eager to witness every moment of Clara's humiliation. She could see the mix of pity and schadenfreude in their faces, some of the women shaking their heads knowingly, as if they had predicted this outcome from the moment she stepped off the train. Keep your money, Clara said, her voice now steady as steel. I wouldn't take a cent from a man who lacks both honor and basic human decency. Gerald's face flushed red. Now see here. No, you see here. Clara interrupted, taking a step forward. The crowd drew in a collective breath at her boldness. You may think you can simply dismiss me like an unsatisfactory purchase, but I have your letters, Mr. Harrington. Letters in which you made specific promises, declarations that could be considered legally binding. You wouldn't dare, Gerald sputtered, but there was fear in his eyes now. Wouldn't I? A woman with nothing left to lose can dare quite a lot, sir. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was broken by the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps on the wooden platform. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, and through the gap walked a man who seemed to command the very air around him. Kieran Holt stood 6 feet 3 inches in his worn boots, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorframe and hands scarred from years of honest work. His face was weathered by sun and wind into something that might have been carved from the mountains themselves, all hard angles and deep lines, with eyes the color of storm clouds that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. He wore simple ranch clothes, denim pants, a faded blue shirt, leather vest, but he carried himself with an authority that made Gerald's expensive suit look like a costume. Problem here, Harrington. His voice was deep, gravelly, the kind of voice that could soothe a spooked horse or send grown men backing away slowly. Gerald straightened, trying to reclaim some authority. No problem at all, Holt. Just a minor misunderstanding with this woman. Misunderstanding. Kieran repeated, his gaze moving from Gerald to Clara. When their eyes met, Clara felt something shift in her chest, like a key turning in a long-locked door. Sounded to me like you were welching on a deal. It's none of your business, Holt, Gerald snapped, but his voice had gone up an octave. Maybe not. Kieran agreed, moving closer. Each step was measured, purposeful. But I've got a particular dislike for men who don't keep their word. Bad for business, bad for the whole town, really. Makes us all look like we can't be trusted. He stopped directly in front of Clara, and she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Up close, she could see the fine lines around them, the evidence of a man who had squinted into too many sunrises, faced down too many storms. Ma'am, he said, touching the brim of his hat. Kieran Holt. I own the Double K Ranch about 5 miles north of town. Clara Whitmore? She managed, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, then turned back to Gerald. So Harrington, you brought this lady all the way from Boston. Was it on promises you're now breaking? Because what? She doesn't look exactly like a photograph. She misrepresented herself, Gerald protested weakly. Kieran's laugh was short and harsh. Every photograph ever taken is a misrepresentation, you fool. What did you expect, that she'd step off the train looking like she'd just walked out of a parlor instead of traveling 5 days across the country? The crowd murmured agreement. Several of the women were nodding, remembering their own arduous journeys west. Furthermore, Kieran continued, his voice rising so everyone could hear, I'd say Miss Whitmore here has shown considerable courage and faith, trusting a man she'd never met, leaving everything behind. That takes a kind of strength you wouldn't understand, Harrington, seeing as the furthest you've ever traveled from your daddy's money is the distance between your ranch and the bank. Gerald's face had gone from red to purple. How dare you? I dare because someone needs to, Kieran shot back. You've embarrassed this lady publicly, broken your word, and shown yourself to be without honor. In my book, that makes you lower than a snake's belly in a wagon rut." The insult hung in the air like gun smoke. For a moment, Clara thought Gerald might actually try to strike Kieran, despite the obvious foolishness of such an action. But then Gerald's shoulders sagged, and he turned on his heel. "Fine," he spat. "She's your problem now, Holt. Don't come crying to me when you realize what damaged goods you're defending." He stormed off toward Main Street, his expensive boots clicking against the boards in rapid retreat. The crowd began to disperse, the show apparently over, though Clara could still feel their curious glances. She stood there suddenly aware that she was now completely alone in a strange town with no money, no prospects, and nowhere to go. The anger that had sustained her during the confrontation drained away, leaving her feeling hollow and frightened. "Miss Whitmore." Kieran's voice drew her attention back. He was studying her with those storm cloud eyes, and she couldn't read his expression. "Do you have a place to stay?" Clara swallowed hard, pride warring with practicality. "No, I assumed that is Mr. Harrington had said." "He had a room prepared at his ranch," Kieran finished, "which obviously isn't an option now." "I'll figure something out," Clara said quickly, though she had no idea what that something might be. She had enough money for perhaps 2 nights at a boarding house, assuming Silver Creek even had one, and then nothing. "The boarding house is full up," Kieran said, as if reading her thoughts. "There's a cattle drive coming through, and every room in town has been spoken for." He paused, seemed to be weighing something in his mind. "I have a proposition for you." Clara stiffened. "Mr. Holt, if you think that just because I'm in a desperate situation—" "Nothing like that," he interrupted, and she thought she saw a flash of amusement in his eyes. "I need a housekeeper. My ranch house hasn't seen a woman's touch since my mother died 3 years ago. I can offer you room board and wages, $3 a week, which is standard for these parts." "A housekeeper," Clara repeated slowly. "That's all," Kieran assured her. "You'd have your own room locked from the inside if you prefer. My ranch hands eat in the bunkhouse, so you'd only be cooking for me most days. Sundays off, and I'll drive you to town whenever you need supplies." It was a lifeline, and they both knew it. But Clara had learned the hard way that lifelines often came with strings attached. "Why?" she asked bluntly. "Why would you offer this to a complete stranger?" Kieran was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving to the mountains visible beyond the town. "Maybe because I know what it's like to have the rug pulled out from under you," he said finally. "Maybe because I don't like seeing good people get trampled by those who think money makes them better than everyone else. Or maybe—" He looked back at her, and this time she was certain she saw warmth in those gray eyes. "Maybe because anyone who can stand up to Gerald Harrington the way you just did is someone worth having around." Despite everything, Clara felt her lips twitch toward a smile. "You don't even know if I can cook. Can you—" "Yes. Can you clean?" "Of course." "Can you handle living 5 miles from town with only a grumpy rancher and a bunch of cowboys for company?" Mr. Holt, Clara said, drawing herself up to her full height, which still only brought her to his shoulder. "I just survived 5 days on a train with a broken heating system, eating nothing but stale sandwiches and lukewarm coffee. I think I can manage." This time Kieran did smile, just a slight upturn of his lips, but it transformed his face completely. "Then we have a deal." Clara looked around the platform at the town that was supposed to have been her new home at the mountains that surrounded them like fortress walls. She had come west for a new life, for adventure and possibility. Perhaps this wasn't the adventure she had planned, but it was what was being offered. 3 months, she said. "I'll give you 3 months as your housekeeper. That should be enough time for me to save some money and figure out my next move." "Fair enough," Kieran agreed. He picked up her cases as if they weighed nothing. "My wagon's just over here." As Clara followed him off the platform, she caught sight of several townspeople still watching. One woman, elderly with sharp eyes, called out, "You be careful, girl. Kieran Holt's a hard man." Kieran paused but didn't turn around. "Hard but fair, Mrs. Morrison. Unlike some." The old woman cackled. "That's true enough. You take care of her, Holt, or you'll answer to me." "Yes, ma'am," Kieran replied with surprising deference. The wagon was practical rather than fancy, sturdy wood, weathered to silver gray, pulled by two enormous draft horses that nickered softly when Kieran approached. He loaded Clara's cases carefully, then offered her his hand to help her up to the bench seat. His hand was calloused and warm, and Clara felt an unexpected jolt when their skin touched. She settled herself on the bench, arranging her skirts, trying to ignore the way her heart was racing. Kieran swung up beside her with easy grace and took the reins. "It's about an hour to the ranch," he said. "The road's rough in places." "I'm not fragile, Mr. Holt." "No," he agreed, clicking to the horses. "I don't believe you are." As they drove through Silver Creek's main street, Clara caught glimpses of what might have been her life. The millinery shop where she might have ordered hats, the general store where she would have bought supplies, the church where she would have been married. People stopped to stare as they passed, and she knew by tomorrow the entire town would be talking about how the rejected mail-order bride had gone home with Kieran Holt. "Does it bother you, Tom?" Kieran asked suddenly. "The gossip there'll be—" Clara considered this. 6 months ago it would have mortified me, but I've learned that reputation is a luxury for those who can afford it. I need work and shelter more than I need the good opinion of strangers. "Practical," Kieran observed. "Desperate," Clara corrected, then wondered why she was being so honest with this man. They left the town behind, following a road that was really just two ruts worn into the prairie grass. The landscape opened up around them, endless sky-rolling grasslands that seemed to go on forever, and always the mountains in the distance, blue and hazy, like a dream. "It's beautiful," Clara said softly. "Different from Boston, I imagine." "Like another world entirely." She paused. "I suppose you think I'm foolish coming all this way for a man I'd never met." Kieran was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "My mother was a mail-order bride." Clara turned to look at him, surprised. "From Ireland." He continued, his eyes on the road ahead. "My father placed an advertisement, she answered it. They wrote for 6 months before she made the journey. Didn't meet until she stepped off the train in Denver." "Were they happy?" A ghost of a smile crossed his face. 40 years together. She died in her sleep with his hand in hers. He followed her 3 months later, said there wasn't much point to staying without her. Clara felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them away quickly. "That's beautiful." "That's rare," Kieran corrected. "Most mail-order marriages are business arrangements that work out to varying degrees of satisfaction. But every once in a while," he shrugged, "every once in a while, two people find each other across impossible distances." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds, the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clop of the horses' hooves. Clara found herself studying Kieran from the corner of her eye, the strong profile, the way his hands held the reins with casual competence, the slight squint against the afternoon sun. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Ask?" "Why aren't you married? A successful rancher established in the community, I'd think you'd have your pick of wives." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Had a fiancé once, 5 years ago." Clara waited, but he didn't elaborate. "What happened?" "She decided a banker from Denver was a better prospect than a rancher from Silver Creek." His tone was matter-of-fact, but Clara heard the old hurt beneath it. "Taught me a valuable lesson about trust. Which is, don't." The single word hung between them like a wall. Clara understood now he'd offered her a job, nothing more. Whatever kindness he'd shown her came from principle, not interest. She was surprised by how disappointed that made her feel. The Double K Ranch. When it finally came into view, took Clara's breath away. The main house was 2 stories of solid log construction with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Behind it, she could see a massive barn, several outbuildings, and what looked like a bunkhouse for the ranch hands. Cattle dotted the landscape as far as she could see, and horses grazed in a nearby pasture. "It's impressive," she said. "It's work," Kieran replied, but she could hear the pride in his voice. Constant, never-ending work. As they pulled up to the house, several men emerged from the barn. Cowboys, Clara realized, studying them with interest. They were exactly as she'd imagined, weather-beaten faces, worn leather chaps, guns at their hips. They watched her with undisguised curiosity. "Boys," Kieran called out, "this is Miss Whitmore. She'll be keeping house for us. Any man who treats her with anything less than complete respect will be looking for new employment. Clear. A chorus of "Yes, boss" rang out. An older man, grizzled and bow-legged, approached the wagon. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat. "Tom Rodriguez, foreman. Pleasure to meet you." "Mr. Rodriguez," Clara replied formally, which seemed to please him. Kieran helped her down from the wagon, and again she felt that unexpected spark when their hands touched. She followed him into the house, trying not to let her nervousness show. The interior was exactly what she'd expected from a house that hadn't seen a woman's touch in 3 years. Everything was functional and sturdy, heavy, wooden furniture, stone fireplace, thick rugs. But there were no curtains on the windows, no pictures on the walls, no flowers or decorative touches of any kind. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight, and she could write her name on most surfaces. "Kitchen's through here," Kieran said, leading her through a doorway. The kitchen was large and well-equipped, though it too showed signs of neglect. Pantry's fully stocked. There's a root cellar out back for vegetables and preserves. He showed her through the rest of the downstairs, a dining room that looked rarely used, a study filled with ledgers and papers, a small parlor with furniture covered in dust sheets. Then up the narrow stairs to the bedrooms. "This will be yours," he said, opening a door at the end of the hall. The room was simple but clean, with a brass bed, a washstand, a wardrobe, and a small desk by the window. "My room's at the other end. The two in between are empty." Clara moved to the window and gasped. The view looked out over endless prairie toward the mountains now painted gold and purple by the setting sun. "It's perfect," she said softly. When she turned around, Kieran was watching her with an unreadable expression. "I'll leave you to get settled. Supper's usually at 6, the hands eat in the bunkhouse like I said. Tonight you don't need to worry about cooking. Tom's wife Maria sent over a pot of stew. Tomorrow you can start fresh." He paused at the door. "Miss Whitmore." "Clara. What happened today with Harrington, that wasn't your fault. Don't let anyone tell you different." Before she could respond, he was gone, his boots echoing down the stairs. Clara sank onto the bed, suddenly exhausted. This morning she'd expected to be planning her wedding to Gerald Harrington. Instead, she was sitting in a stranger's house, employed as a housekeeper with no idea what her future held. She opened one of her cases and pulled out the packet of letters from Gerald, tied with a ribbon she now realized was far too romantic for what had been essentially a business transaction. She considered burning them, then decided against it. They were evidence of her foolishness, perhaps, but also of her courage. Not every woman would have risked everything on the promise of love. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. The door opened to reveal a small, round woman with graying hair and a warm smile. "Miss Whitmore, I'm Maria Rodriguez, Tom's wife. Mr. Holt asked me to check if you needed anything." "That's very kind, but I'm fine, thank you." Maria entered anyway, carrying a tray with a bowl of stew and fresh bread. "You need to eat, she said firmly, "and we need to talk." Clara accepted the tray gratefully, realizing she hadn't eaten since breakfast on the train. The stew was delicious, rich with beef and vegetables, and the bread was still warm. "I live in town," Maria explained, settling herself in the desk chair. "But I come out twice a week to do laundry for the ranch hands. I've been trying to convince Mr. Holt to hire a housekeeper for 2 years now." "Why wouldn't he?" Clara asked between bites. Maria's expression grew sad. That business with his fiancée hurt him deep. Rebecca was her name, pretty thing daughter of a local merchant. Everyone thought they were perfect for each other. Then this banker came through town, turned her head with promises of city life and fancy clothes. She broke the engagement 2 weeks before the wedding. How awful. It was, but what made it worse was that she'd been carrying on with the banker for months before she ended things with Mr. Holt. The whole town knew before he did. Maria shook her head. "He's been closed off ever since. Buries himself in work, rarely goes to town except for supplies. This ranch is his whole world now." Clara set down her spoon, appetite fading. "Then why did he hire me?" Maria studied her shrewdly. "I was watching from the general store window when Harrington dismissed you, saw the whole thing, and I saw Mr. Holt's face when he looked at you. He was just being kind." "Kieran Holt doesn't do just kind," Maria interrupted. "He's fair, he's honorable, but he doesn't go out of his way for strangers. There was something about you that caught his attention. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. You're imagining things. Maybe, Maria agreed, standing, but I've known that man since he was a boy, and today's the first time in 5 years I've seen him really look at a woman. She moved to the door, then paused. A word of advice, dear. Kieran Holt is like a wounded bear, dangerous if cornered, but capable of great gentleness if you're patient. Don't push him. Let him come to you in his own time. After Maria left, Clara finished her supper and unpacked her few belongings. She hung her dresses in the wardrobe, arranged her books on the desk, and placed her mother's silver brush set on the washstand. Such small things to represent a life, but they made the room feel a little more like hers. As darkness fell, she could hear the sounds of the ranch settling for the night, horses nickering in the barn, the low voices of cowboys in the bunkhouse, the distant lowing of cattle. It was so different from the constant noise of Boston, the clatter of carriages and voices that never ceased. She changed into her nightgown and wrapper, then ventured downstairs to explore the kitchen more thoroughly. If she was going to cook for Kieran Mr. Holt, she corrected herself, she needed to know what she had to work with. The pantry was indeed well stocked, though organized with typical male efficiency, which is to say not organized at all. She found flour, sugar, salt, coffee beans, preserved meats, canned goods, and various other staples all jumbled together. There was work to be done here, certainly. She was examining the stove, a massive cast-iron beast that would take some getting used to when she heard footsteps. Kieran appeared in the doorway, looking surprised to find her there. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Just getting familiar with everything," Claire replied, suddenly aware that she was in her nightclothes, even if she was fully covered by the wrapper. "I hope that's all right." "It's your kitchen now," he said. "Do whatever you need to do." He moved to the stove and added wood to the firebox. "This beast takes some getting used to. Runs hot, so you need to watch it careful. Maria can show you its quirks if you need." "I'm sure I'll manage." They stood there awkwardly for a moment, neither seeming to know what to say. Finally, Kieran cleared his throat. "I'm usually up at dawn. Coffee and breakfast around 6, if that suits." "Of course." He started to leave, then turned back. "Clara, Miss Whitmore. What I said earlier about trust, I didn't mean that is you're safe here. I want you to know that." "I know," Clara said softly, and realized she did. Despite his gruffness, despite barely knowing him, she felt safe with Kieran Holt in a way she'd never felt with Gerald's flowery letters. He nodded and left, and Clara stood alone in the kitchen, her kitchen now, and wondered what she'd gotten herself into. 3 months, she'd said. 3 months to figure out her next move, to save some money to decide what kind of life she wanted to build in this wild, beautiful place. She thought about Gerald Harrington probably sitting in his fancy ranch house right now, congratulating himself on avoiding a mistake. He'd called her inferior goods, damaged. The memory still stung, but underneath the hurt was something else, relief. What kind of life would she have had with a man who could dismiss her so easily, who saw her as a purchase to be evaluated rather than a person to be known? And then she thought about Kieran Holt defending her to the entire town, offering her work and shelter without expecting anything in return. He was hard, yes, and closed off. But there was something underneath that exterior, something she'd glimpsed when he talked about his parents, when he'd assured her she was safe. Clara made her way back upstairs, pausing at the window to look out at the vast prairie under stars. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light clearer than she'd ever seen it in Boston. Somewhere out there, a coyote howled, and another answered their calls, echoing across the distance. She'd come west for a new life, and against all odds, that's exactly what she'd found. Not the life she'd planned, perhaps, but maybe that was for the best. Plans had a way of falling apart, as she'd learned today. But sometimes what rose from the ruins was stronger than what had been there before. Tomorrow she would start her new job as housekeeper at the Double K Ranch. She would cook and clean and make this house a home again, even if only temporarily. She would prove to Kieran Holt, to the town, and most importantly to herself, that she was nobody's inferior goods. She was Clara Whitmore, and she would make her own way in this world one day at a time. As she settled into bed, she heard Kieran moving around in his room at the other end of the hall. The sound was oddly comforting, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this big house. She pulled the quilts up to her chin, breathing in the scent of sage and cedar that seemed to permeate everything here. Her last thought before sleep took her was of storm-gray eyes and a voice like distant thunder saying her name, Clara. Not Miss Whitmore, but Clara, as if it mattered, as if she mattered. 3 months, she'd said. But lying there in the darkness, listening to the vast silence of the prairie night, Clara wondered if 3 months would be nearly enough. The rooster's crow pierced through Clara's dreams, pulling her from sleep, just as the first pale light of dawn crept across the prairie. For a moment she lay disoriented, the brass bed frame unfamiliar beneath her hands, until the events of yesterday came rushing back. She was at the Double K Ranch employed as a housekeeper, and Kieran Holt would be expecting coffee and breakfast in less than an hour. She dressed quickly in her simplest work dress, a brown calico that had seen better days but would serve well enough for housework, and pinned her auburn hair into a practical bun. The house was silent as she made her way downstairs, her footsteps careful on the creaking boards. The kitchen was cold, the stove having died to embers during the night, and she set about reviving it with the expertise born of years tending her own small apartment in Boston. Coffee, first strong and black the way most ranchers seemed to prefer it. While it brewed, she investigated the pantry more thoroughly, finding eggs in a basket, bacon wrapped in cheesecloth, and day-old biscuits that would do well enough if warmed. Not fancy, but substantial fare for a working man. She was just pulling the bacon from the skillet when she heard boots on the porch. Kieran entered through the back door, bringing with him the scent of hay and horses. He'd obviously been up for some time already, checking on the livestock, as ranchers did. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough with early morning gravel. His hair was damp, suggesting he'd washed at the pump outside, and there was a small cut on his jaw from shaving. "Good morning, Mr. Holt. Coffee's ready, and breakfast will be just a moment." He poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter watching her work. Clara tried not to feel self-conscious under his scrutiny, focusing on plating the eggs just right, arranging the bacon neatly. "You don't have to fuss," he said. "I'm used to Tom throwing something on a plate and calling it good." "Well, you're not eating Tom's cooking anymore," Clara replied, setting the plate before him at the kitchen table. "You're paying for a housekeeper, you might as well get proper meals out of it." Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. "Yes, ma'am." He ate in silence while Clara cleaned up, but she could feel him watching her, not in an uncomfortable way, but as if he was trying to figure something out. "I'll be working the south pasture today, he said finally, pushing back from the table. "Won't be back until supper. There's salt pork and beans in the pantry if you need something for your own lunch." "Actually," Clara said, turning from the sink, "I was thinking I might clean out the pantry today, organize things properly, and that parlor needs a thorough going over. Would that be acceptable?" "This is your domain now, Miss Whitmore. Do whatever you think needs doing." After he left, Clara threw herself into the work with a vengeance. She started with the kitchen, scrubbing every surface until it gleamed, organizing the pantry with logical precision, taking inventory of what was available and making lists of what was needed. She found mouse droppings in one corner and made a mental note to ask about getting a cat. The parlor was a bigger challenge. Dust lay thick on every surface, and the furniture under the sheets was good quality, but desperately in need of polish. She opened all the windows, despite the cool morning air, letting the prairie wind blow through and chase away the musty smell of disuse. It was while cleaning the mantelpiece that she found the photograph hidden behind a carved wooden horse. A younger Kieran stood beside a pretty blonde woman in a white dress. They were both smiling, his arm around her waist, her hand on his chest displaying an engagement ring. Rebecca. This must be the woman who'd broken his heart and his trust in one fell swoop. Clara studied the photograph, noting how different Kieran looked. Not just younger, but softer, somehow, more open. The man in this picture hadn't yet learned to guard himself against the world. That should have been thrown out long ago. Clara jumped, nearly dropping the photograph. Kieran stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry." "You're cleaning. You're bound to find things." He crossed the room and took the photograph from her hands, staring at it for a moment before tossing it into the fireplace. "Some things are better left in the past." "Mr. Holt, I thought I'd be gone all day, but one of the horses threw a shoe. Tom's dealing with it." He looked around the parlor, seeming to notice the transformation for the first time. "You've been busy." "It's good to keep busy," Clara said, then wondered why she felt the need to explain herself. He moved to one of the windows she'd opened, looking out at the prairie. "My mother loved this room. Used to sit here in the evenings doing her needlework while my father read the newspapers out loud. A pause. Haven't spent much time in here since she died. It's a lovely room, good light, comfortable furniture. It seems a shame not to use it. Maybe, he said noncommittally, then seemed to shake himself from his reverie. I'll be in my study if you need anything. Clara returned to her cleaning, but her mind kept wandering to that photograph, to the way Kieran had looked at it before destroying it. She understood holding on to hurt she'd done it herself, after her father's business failed, after her mother died, after every disappointment that had led her to answer a stranger's advertisement for a bride. But she'd also learned that holding on too tight to old pain could strangle any chance at new happiness. By midday, the parlor was transformed. She'd beaten the rugs outside, polished every stick of furniture, washed the windows until they sparkled. She'd even found some old curtains in a trunk, and while they needed mending, they were better than bare windows. The room looked lived in again, welcoming. She was heating leftover stew for her lunch when Tom Rodriguez appeared at the kitchen door. Miss Whitmore boss wanted me to check if you needed anything from town. I'm heading in for supplies. Clara consulted her list. Actually, yes, if it's not too much trouble. She handed him the paper, then hesitated. Mr. Rodriguez, is there any chance of getting a cat? I found evidence of mice in the pantry. Tom grinned. The widow Patterson's cat just had kittens. I'm sure she'd be happy to part with one or two. Ranch could use some Mausers. 2 would be better, Clara agreed. They keep each other company. You're already thinking like a ranch woman, Tom observed. Boss seems easier today, too. Haven't seen him come back to the house midday in years. After Tom left, Clara tackled the dining room, discovering a beautiful oak table under years of dust and neglect. She was polishing it when she heard raised voices from outside. Moving to the window, she saw Kieran facing off with 3 men she didn't recognize. They were better dressed than cowboys, their clothes marking them as townsmen. You can tell Harrington my answer hasn't changed, Kieran was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the open window. I'm not selling that water access, not for any price. Mr. Harrington is prepared to be very generous, one of the men said. More than generous, considering... Considering what? Kieran's voice had gone dangerously quiet. Considering you've taken in his discarded bride. People are talking Holt, saying you only hired her to spite him. Clara's hands clenched in the curtains. So it had started already, the gossip and speculation. People can say whatever they damn well please, Kieran replied. Miss Whitmore is my housekeeper, nothing more or less. And that has exactly nothing to do with Harrington's water problems. He could make things difficult for you, another man warned. He's got influence and town connections in Denver. And I've got the only reliable water source for 20 miles in any direction. He can make all the threats he wants, but come drought season, his fancy connections won't keep his cattle alive. The men exchanged glances, clearly recognizing the truth in this. They left shortly after, but Clara could see the tension in Kieran's shoulders as he watched them go. She returned to her polishing, pretending she hadn't witnessed the exchange, when Kieran came back inside. But he stopped in the dining room doorway, taking in her work. You heard all that, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Harrington's been after my water rights for 2 years. The creek that runs through my property is spring-fed. Never runs dry, even in the worst drought. His land has seasonal streams that disappear come July. And now he's using me as a leverage. Trying to. Kieran moved into the room, running his hand along the newly polished table. He's a petty man who can't stand being crossed. Your rejection of his money this morning probably stung worse than anything else. I couldn't take it, not after what he said. No, you couldn't, Kieran agreed. You've got too much pride for that. Same reason you're working yourself to exhaustion today, trying to prove you're worth your wages. Clara flushed. I'm simply doing my job. You've done more in one morning than this house has seen in 3 years. You don't have to prove anything to me, Clara. It was the first time he'd used her given name since yesterday, and something about the way he said it made her stomach flutter unexpectedly. Before she could respond, Tom returned from town with a wagon full of supplies and a basket that mewed plaintively. 2 orange kittens tumbled out when Clara opened it, immediately beginning to explore their new domain. Widow Patterson says they're already weaned and showing good hunting instincts, Tom reported. Also, she sent this. He handed Clara a covered dish. Said she heard you were working here now and wanted to welcome you proper. That's very kind of her. Folks in town are divided, Tom said carefully, glancing at Kieran. Some think you were treated shamefully by Harrington. Others think, well, it doesn't matter what others think. It matters if it makes things difficult for Miss Whitmore, Kieran said. I've weathered gossip before, Clara interjected. I'll weather it again. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. Clara established the kittens in the kitchen with a box of sand and scraps of salt pork, then began preparations for supper. She found a roast in the cold storage and vegetables in the root cellar, deciding to make something more elaborate than the simple fare Kieran was apparently accustomed to. She was just putting the roast in the oven when Maria Rodriguez arrived with her laundry basket. Heard you had quite the morning, Maria said without preamble. Gerald Harrington's telling anyone who'll listen that Kieran stole you right off the platform. That's ridiculous, Clara protested. Of course it is, but it makes for good gossip. The virtuous woman led astray by the dangerous rancher. Maria's eyes twinkled. Though I have to say you don't look particularly led astray. You look like a woman who's found her footing. Clara thought about this as she helped Maria sort the ranch hand's laundry. Had she found her footing? This morning she'd woken uncertain and anxious, but somewhere between scrubbing the kitchen and facing down the implications of Gerald's petty revenge, she'd begun to feel something she hadn't felt in months useful, needed even. Can I ask you something? Clara said, feeding clothes through the wringer while Maria operated the washtub. Why does Gerald want Kieran's water right so badly? Surely there must be other options. Maria's expression grew serious. Gerald inherited his ranch from his father, but he's never had the knack for it, makes bad decisions, doesn't read the land right. His streams are drying up because he overgrazed the watershed. Kieran's been managing water on this land since he was a boy. Learned from his father, who learned from the Indians who were here before. The Double K has water because Kieran makes sure it does. So Gerald wants to buy his way out of his mistakes. Like he always does. His daddy left him rich enough to paper over most of his failures, but you can't buy water from dry ground. Maria paused in her washing. Thing is, if Kieran sold him those rights, Gerald would probably ruin that water source too within 5 years. Kieran knows that. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of washing almost meditative. Clara found herself relaxing in Maria's presence, the older woman's matter-of-fact warmth, a comfort after the emotional upheaval of the past 2 days. You're good for him, Maria said suddenly. Kieran, he's been alone too long, shut away with his hurt. Having you here, it's like opening windows in a closed house. I'm just his housekeeper, Clara protested. If you say so, Maria replied, but her smile suggested she thought otherwise. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Clara put the finishing touches on supper. The roast was perfect, the vegetables tender, the gravy rich and smooth. She'd even managed a pie with the dried apples she'd found in the pantry. She was setting the table in the dining room, the formal dining room she'd spent the afternoon cleaning, when Kieran appeared in the doorway. We usually eat in the kitchen, he said, but he was looking at the transformed room with something like wonder. The dining room is meant for dining, Claire replied firmly. Besides, I spent 3 hours polishing that table. Someone ought to appreciate it. He disappeared to wash up, returning in a clean shirt with his hair damp and neatly combed. Clara tried not to notice how the lamplight caught the silver threads at his temples, how his eyes seemed less guarded in the warm glow. This is too much, he said when she brought in the roast. It's dinner, Clara countered. Sit down and eat it while it's hot. He sat and she served him, and for a moment the domesticity of it all made her chest tight. This was what she'd imagined when she'd answered Gerald's advertisement. Not the grand romance, but this simple rhythm of daily life, of cooking for someone who appreciated it, of making a house into a home. This is exceptional, Kieran said after his first bite. Where did you learn to cook like this? My mother. She believed a woman should know how to run a household even if she had servants to do it for her. Clara took her own seat across from him rather than at the far end of the table. Of course, after my father's business failed, those skills became less theoretical and more practical. Is that why you answered Harrington's advertisement? The business failure? Clara considered how much to tell him. Partly. Father died 2 years ago, still trying to recover what he'd lost. Mother followed 6 months later, heart failure, the doctor said, but I think it was heartbreak. I'd been living on what I could earn as a seamstress, but it wasn't enough. When I saw Gerald's advertisement, it seemed like a chance at something better. I'm sorry about your parents. We all have our losses, Clara said, thinking of the photograph he'd burned that morning. They ate in silence for a while, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The kittens had ventured in from the kitchen and were exploring the dining room with comic intensity, pouncing on dust motes and shadows. You didn't have to do all this to, Kieran said eventually, gesturing at the room, the meal, everything. I hired you for basic housekeeping. Is it too much? Clara asked, suddenly uncertain. I don't mean to overstep. No, he said quickly. It's not too much. It's just, this house hasn't felt like this since my mother was alive, like a home instead of just a place to sleep. Every house should be a home, Clara said softly, even if it's only temporary. Something shifted in his expression at the word temporary. But before Clara could analyze it, one of the kittens attempted to climb his leg, tiny claws catching in his pants. He scooped it up, and the sight of this large, rough man cradling a tiny orange kitten made Clara's heart do something complicated in her chest. What are their names? He asked. I haven't named them yet. Thought maybe you should, since they're your cats. They're your Mausers, he corrected. You name them. Clara studied the kittens. One was slightly larger, bolder, always the first to explore. The other was smaller but cleverer, figuring out how to get places its sibling couldn't. Samson and Delilah, she decided. Sam and Del for short. Biblical cats. Seems appropriate for a place that needs a little divine intervention in the mouse department. Was that a smile? Just a slight upturn of his lips. But Clara was beginning to treasure these small breaks in his stoic facade. After dinner, she wouldn't let him help clear the table. You're paying me to do this, she reminded him. Go smoke your pipe or read your newspaper or whatever it is you do in the evenings. I don't smoke, Barry, he said. And the newspaper's a week old. Usually I go over the account books, but maybe tonight I'll sit in the parlor instead. Test out those chairs you spent so much time polishing. Clara tried not to feel pleased as she washed the dishes, listening to him moving around in the parlor. When she finally joined him bringing coffee, she found him standing by the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. Storm coming, he said. Probably tomorrow night. You can feel it in the air. Is that bad for the ranch, I mean? Not this time of year. The grass needs the rain and the cattle are close enough to shelter. But these spring storms can be fierce. Hope the roof over your room is sound. I'm sure it's fine. He turned from the window to look at her. You really aren't afraid of much, are you? I'm afraid of plenty, Clara admitted, settling into one of the chairs with her coffee. I was terrified yesterday when Gerald rejected me. Terrified I'd end up on the streets or worse. But I learned something when my father lost everything. You can be afraid and still keep moving forward. Fear only wins if you let it stop you. Kieran sat in the chair across from her, the lamp on the table between them, creating a circle of warm light in the growing darkness. Most women would have taken Harrington's money. Most women haven't had to survive what I have. Pride might be a luxury, Mr. Holt, but sometimes it's the only thing nobody can take from you. Kieran, he said suddenly, if we're going to be living in the same house, you might as well call me Kieran. All right, Kieran. The name felt strange on her tongue, intimate somehow. They sat quietly drinking their coffee while the wind picked up outside. The kittens played at their feet, stalking each other through the chair legs. It was oddly peaceful, this shared silence, like they'd known each other for years instead of days. I should warn you, Kieran said eventually. Tomorrow's Saturday. Some of the hands will likely go into town, blow off steam at the saloon. They might hear talk about you, about us. And they're good men, but they're protective of the ranch, of me. If anyone says something inappropriate about you, there could be trouble. Clara set down her coffee cup with a decisive click. Then perhaps I should go to town too. Let people see I'm not being held captive or led astray or whatever nonsense Gerald is spreading. That might not be wise. Hiding would be worse, Clara interrupted. It would look like we have something to be ashamed of. I'm your housekeeper, you're my employer, and there's nothing improper about that. The best way to kill gossip is to face it head on. Kieran studied her for a long moment. You're either very brave or very foolish. Probably both, but I'm also right. Maybe you are. He stood stretching muscles probably sore from a day of ranch work. I'll drive you to town tomorrow if you're determined to go. Better than you going alone. After he went upstairs, Clara remained in the parlor watching the fire die to embers. She could hear him moving around above the creak of floorboards marking his path from washstand to bed. Such an intimate thing to know another person's nighttime routines, to share a house with someone who was essentially a stranger. But was he a stranger? In 2 days, she'd learned more about Kieran Holt than Gerald's letters had revealed about him in 6 months of correspondence. She knew he took his coffee black, that he was left-handed, that he had a small scar on his jaw from a childhood fall. She knew he still grieved, his parents still nursed wounds from a faithless fiancé, still maintained his principles, even when it cost him. She gathered the kittens and climbed the stairs to her room, pausing at the landing. Kieran's door was closed, but she could see lamplight beneath it. For a moment she imagined knocking, asking if he needed anything, but that would be inappropriate. She was his housekeeper, nothing more, despite the strange flutter in her chest when he said her name. Her room was cold, but the quilts were warm and the kittens curled up beside her, purring contentedly. Through her window she could see clouds gathering, obscuring the stars one by one. A storm was coming, Kieran had said. Clara pulled the quilts higher and closed her eyes, wondering if he meant more than just the weather. She'd been at the Double K Ranch for exactly 1 day, and already her carefully planned 3 months felt both too long and not nearly long enough. She'd come west looking for a husband and found instead a job. But maybe, just maybe, she'd found something else too, a place where her pride wasn't a liability, where her strength was appreciated rather than resented, where a wounded man might learn to trust again if given time and patience. The wind rattled her windows, and somewhere in the darkness a coyote howled. But Clara wasn't afraid. She'd faced worse storms than whatever was coming, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't facing it alone. Saturday morning dawned gray and heavy, the promised storm building on the horizon like an army massing for battle. Clara woke to find Sam and Dell pressed against her, their small bodies vibrating with purrs as thunder rumbled distantly across the prairie. She dressed carefully for her trip to town, choosing her second-best dress, a deep green wool that brought out the color in her eyes and suggested respectability without ostentation. If she was going to face down the gossips of Silver Creek, she would do it properly armored. Kieran was already in the kitchen when she came down, staring moodily into his coffee cup. He looked up at her entrance, and something flickered in his eyes as he took in her appearance. "You're determined to do this," he said. It wasn't a question. "I need supplies anyway," Clara replied, moving to the stove to start breakfast. "And I'd like to attend church tomorrow. Hiding away would only fuel more speculation." "Church," Kieran repeated, as if the word was foreign to him. "Yes, church. The place where people gather on Sundays to pray and pretend they haven't been gossiping about their neighbors all week." She cracked eggs into the skillet with perhaps more force than necessary. "Do you attend?" "Not since my mother died." Clara wasn't surprised. She'd noticed the absence of religious items in the house, unusual for a frontier home where faith was often the only comfort against the harsh realities of survival. "Well, I intend to go. Will that be a problem?" "You're free to do as you please on Sundays. I said that when I hired you." They ate breakfast in relative silence, the only sounds the scrape of forks against plates and the increasingly insistent wind rattling the windows. When they finished, Kieran went to ready the wagon while Clara made a list of supplies and pinned on her best hat, a small thing with a single feather that had somehow survived the journey from Boston intact. The ride to town was tense, though Clara couldn't say exactly why. Perhaps it was the approaching storm that made the air feel electric. Or perhaps it was the way Kieran kept glancing at her, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. The prairie grass bent before the wind in waves, creating patterns that looked almost like water, and Clara found herself mesmerized by the sight. "It's beautiful," she said, more to break the silence than anything else. "Most people find it monotonous, nothing but grass for miles. Those people aren't looking properly. See there, the way the light catches the seed heads, and there where the wind creates channels. It's like watching the ocean but golden instead of blue." Kieran followed her pointing finger, and she saw him really look, perhaps for the first time in years.
My mother used to say the same thing, said the prairie was God's way of showing us that beauty didn't need to be complicated. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. She would have liked you. The comment hung between them more intimate somehow than anything else he'd said. Clara didn't know how to respond, so she didn't, and they completed the journey in a silence that was less tense and more contemplative. Silver Creek was busier than it had been on Thursday, with ranch families in town for Saturday shopping and socializing. Clara could feel the weight of stares as Kieran helped her down from the wagon, could hear the whispers starting before her feet even touched the ground. "Ignore them," Kieran said quietly, his hand at her elbow as they walked toward the general store. "I'm not ignoring anything," Clara replied, lifting her chin and meeting every stare directly. "Good morning, Mrs. Morrison," she called to the elderly woman who'd warned her about Kieran that first day. Mrs. Morrison's eyes widened at being addressed so directly, but she recovered quickly.
Good morning, Miss Whitmore. Mr. Holt, doing some shopping. Yes, ma'am. The Double K's pantry needs restocking, and I have a long list. I imagine it does after 3 years of bachelor living. The old woman's eyes glinted with something that might have been approval. You'll find Mr. Henderson has gotten in a new shipment of fabrics if you're interested. Some very nice ginghams and calicos. Thank you, I'll be sure to look. As they entered the general store, Clara was aware of conversations stopping, of heads turning to track their movement. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, seemed torn between his obvious curiosity and his desire to maintain Kieran's business. Miss Whitmore, Mr. Holt, he greeted them carefully. How can I help you today? Clara handed him her list, and while he began gathering items, she moved through the store examining goods with the careful attention of a woman who knew how to stretch $1. She was comparing prices on coffee when she heard a familiar, unwelcome voice. Well, well, if it isn't the new housekeeper. Gerald Harrington stood at the entrance of the store, flanked by 2 of the men who'd visited the ranch yesterday. He was dressed impeccably as always, his clothes proclaiming his wealth to anyone who cared to look. But Clara noticed something she hadn't seen before, a meanness around his mouth, a petty cruelty in his pale eyes. Mr. Harrington, she acknowledged coolly, not bothering to turn fully toward him. I hope you're finding your new position suitable, though I imagine it's quite a step down from what you expected when you arrived. Clara did turn then, meeting his gaze directly. On the contrary, Mr. Harrington, I find my current situation far superior to what was originally offered. Mr. Holt is an employer who honors his word, pays fair wages, and treats his employees with respect. I couldn't ask for better. Gerald's face flushed. How touching. Though I wonder what people will say when they learn you're living alone with him in that house miles from town. The impropriety of it. The only impropriety, Kieran's voice cut through the store like a blade, is a man who brings a woman across the country on false promises and then abandons her because she doesn't meet his shallow standards. He had appeared from behind the flour barrels, moving with the quiet grace that Clara was beginning to recognize as characteristic. Now he stood beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. I'd be careful, Holt, Gerald warned. You're not as untouchable as you think. I have friends' influence. You have your daddy's money, Kieran corrected, which you've been spending like water trying to buy what you're too incompetent to earn. How many cattle did you lose last winter? Harrington, 50-60. Because you were too proud to ask for advice and too stupid to read the weather signs. The store had gone completely silent, everyone listening with the rapt attention of an audience at a theatrical performance. Clara could see Mrs. Morrison near the fabric display, her weathered face split by a grin of unholy glee. You'll regret this, Gerald hissed. Both of you. I'll make sure, Mr. Harrington, Clara interrupted, her voice sweet as honey and twice as deadly. Are you threatening me because I should remind you that I still have your letters? All of them, including the one where you described in detail the financial arrangements you claim to have in place for our future. I wonder what the territorial authorities would make of such fraudulent representations. Gerald went pale. You wouldn't dare. I've already dared quite a lot, as you've noted. What's one more thing? She stepped forward, and though she had to crane her neck to look up at him, somehow she seemed the taller of the two. "Leave us alone, Mr. Harrington. Find another woman to deceive another ranch to ruin with your incompetence, but leave the Double K and everyone associated with it in peace." For a moment, the tableau held Gerald trembling with rage. Clara standing firm, Kieran watching with an expression that might have been admiration, the entire store holding its collective breath. Then Gerald spun on his expensive heel and stormed out, his companions scrambling to follow. The moment the door slammed behind them, the store erupted in excited chatter. Clara found herself suddenly surrounded by women all talking at once. "That was magnificent, dear." "About time someone stood up to that pompous fool. My sister was nearly taken in by one of his advertisements last year. Thank the Lord she changed her mind." Clara fielded their comments as gracefully as she could, aware of Kieran watching from near the counter. When she finally extracted herself and rejoined him, he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You've made an enemy," he said quietly. "I've made several friends too, by the look of it." "Harrington doesn't forget slights. He'll make trouble if he can." Clara shrugged. "Let him try. I've faced worse than Gerald Harrington and survived." They completed their shopping with considerably less tension, the other customers now treating Clara with something approaching warmth. Mrs. Morrison insisted on introducing her to several other women, including the minister's wife, who extracted a promise that Clara would indeed attend church tomorrow. It was as they were loading the wagon that Tom Rodriguez appeared slightly out of breath. "Boss, we've got a problem. That section of fence in the north pasture is down again, and there's about 30 head of cattle making for Harrington's land." Kieran cursed under his breath. "How bad is the fence?" "Bad. Looks like someone cut it." Clara and Kieran exchanged glances. "Harrington?" she asked. "Probably. He's done it before when he wants to cause trouble. Then he claims our cattle damaged his property and demands compensation." Kieran ran a hand through his hair. "Tom, get the boys and start rounding up the strays. I'll be there as soon as I get Miss Whitmore home." "I can help," Clara offered. Both men looked at her as if she'd suggested flying to the moon. "You ever worked cattle?" Tom asked skeptically. "No, but I can follow instructions, and I'm not afraid of hard work." "It's dangerous," Kieran said firmly, "especially with a storm coming." "So is letting Harrington steal your cattle or claim damages," Clara countered. "You need every hand you can get, and I'm offering." They argued about it all the way back to the ranch, but Clara held firm. Finally, perhaps recognizing the futility of trying to change her mind, Kieran relented. "You stay with the wagon," he ordered as they reached the north pasture. "If any cattle come this way, just wave your arms and yell. Don't try to chase them on foot." Clara agreed, though she suspected she'd end up doing more than just waving her arms. Sure enough, she'd barely been there 10 minutes when a small group of cattle appeared ambling toward the damaged fence, with the single-minded determination of animals who sensed freedom. "Oh, no you don't," Clara muttered, jumping down from the wagon. She grabbed a horse blanket from the back and began waving it like a flag, moving to block their path. "Get back! Go on!" The cattle, unimpressed by her display, kept coming. The lead steer, a massive creature with horns that seemed designed for intimidation, lowered his head and snorted. Clara stood her ground. "Don't you dare," she told it firmly. "I've faced down Gerald Harrington today. I'm not about to be intimidated by a cow." The steer paused, perhaps confused by this small human who refused to move. Clara took the opportunity to advance, still waving the blanket and adding what she hoped were appropriate cattle-moving sounds. To her amazement, the group began to turn, ambling back toward where she could see Kieran and the others working to repair the fence. "Well done," Tom called out as he rode up. "You've got the makings of a ranch woman, after all." Clara felt absurdly pleased by the compliment. She spent the next 2 hours helping where she could, handing tools to the men working on the fence, keeping watch for more straying cattle, and at one point holding a spooked calf while Tom removed a tangle of wire from its leg. By the time they finished, the storm was almost upon them. The sky had turned an ominous green-black, and lightning flickered along the horizon. They made it back to the ranch house just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. "Get inside," Kieran ordered, practically pushing Clara toward the door. "This is going to be bad." He was right. Within minutes, the rain was coming down in sheets driven horizontal by the wind. Thunder crashed directly overhead, making the windows rattle in their frames. Clara busied herself making coffee and sandwiches for the men who straggled in soaked and muddy from their work. "Hell of a thing," one of the cowboys said, accepting a cup gratefully. "That fence didn't cut itself." "We know Jake," Kieran said tiredly. He'd changed into dry clothes, but his hair was still damp, curling slightly at the nape of his neck. "But proving it is another matter." "Miss Whitmore did good out there," Tom announced to the room at large. "Turned back 5 head all by herself just by scolding them like naughty children." The men laughed, and Clara felt herself blushing. "They weren't very determined escapees," she said modestly. "Don't sell yourself short," Kieran said. "You did well today, both in town and at the pasture." Their eyes met across the kitchen, and Clara felt that increasingly familiar flutter in her chest. There was something in his gaze, a warmth that hadn't been there even this morning, as if seeing her stand up to Gerald and then pitch in with the ranch work had shifted something in how he saw her. The storm raged on through the evening. The men eventually retreated to the bunkhouse, leaving Clara and Kieran alone in the kitchen. She was washing the last of the dishes when a particularly violent crack of thunder made her jump, dropping a plate that shattered on the floor. "Oh, I'm sorry, It's just a plate," Kieran said, already kneeling to collect the pieces. "Are you all right?" "Fine, just startled." She knelt too, reaching for a large shard at the same moment he did. Their hands collided, and suddenly they were very close, close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes, could smell the soap he used mixed with something uniquely him. "Clara," he said softly, and her name sounded different when he said it like that, low and rough and full of something she didn't quite dare to name. "Kieran," she whispered back, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her. The air between them seemed to crackle with the same electricity that filled the storm outside. Then another crash of thunder broke the spell, and they both pulled back, suddenly awkward. "The roof," Kieran said, standing abruptly. "I should check the roof, make sure it's holding." He was gone before Clara could respond, leaving her kneeling among the broken pieces of the plate. She cleaned them up slowly, her hands shaking slightly, whether from the near kiss or the storm she couldn't say. She was in the parlor, trying to read by lamplight, while the storm continued its assault, when she heard the crash from upstairs. Racing up the stairs, she found Kieran in her room, rain pouring through a hole in the roof where a tree branch had punched through. "We need to move your things," he shouted over the storm. Together, they grabbed her belongings, throwing them hastily into her trunk and dragging it into the hallway. The rain was soaking everything, and Clara could see water starting to seep through the ceiling boards. "You can't sleep here," Kieran said, stating the obvious. "Take the room next to mine. It's dry and the roof is sound." They moved her things into the new room, which was indeed dry, and actually slightly larger than her original one. It also shared a wall with Kieran's room, a fact that Clara tried not to think about too closely. "I'll get Tom and we'll tarp the roof first thing in the morning," Kieran said. "I'm sorry about this. I should have checked." "It's not your fault a tree branch decided to attack my roof," Clara interrupted. "These things happen." He stood in the doorway of her new room, water still dripping from his hair where he'd been caught in the rain from the hole. Without thinking, Clara grabbed a towel from her washstand and reached up to dry his hair. He went very still under her touch, and Clara suddenly realized what she was doing. But before she could pull away, his hand came up to cover hers, holding the towel and her hand against his head. "Clara," he said again, that same rough whisper from the kitchen. "I should let you get into dry clothes," she said. But she didn't move, couldn't move with his hand over hers and his eyes holding her captive. "I was wrong," he said suddenly. "This morning, when I said my mother would have liked you, I was wrong." Clara felt her heart sink. "Oh." She wouldn't have just liked you. She would have loved you. She would have taken one look at the way you stood up to Harrington, the way you pitched in with the cattle, the way you've brought this house back to life. And she would have loved you. Clara's breath caught. "Kieran, I know you're only here for 3 months, he continued as if he needed to get the words out before he lost his nerve. "I know you'll probably want to move on, find something better than being a housekeeper on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. But Clara, these past 3 days, this house hasn't just come back to life. I feel like I have too." The storm chose that moment to unleash its full fury, thunder crashing so loudly that the whole house shook. They jumped apart the moment broken once again. "I should go," Kieran said roughly. "Make sure nothing else is damaged. Good night, Clara." He was gone before she could formulate a response, leaving her standing in her new room with her hand still tingling from where he'd held it. She could hear him moving in his room next door, the creak of floorboards, the scrape of a chair. Such intimate sounds now that only a wall separated them. Clara prepared for bed in a daze, her mind replaying the evening's events. The way he'd looked at her in the kitchen, the feeling of his hair under her hands, his words about his mother, and about coming back to life. What did it all mean? And more importantly, what did she want it to mean? She'd come to Silver Creek expecting to marry Gerald Harrington, a man she'd thought she could build a life with based on pretty words and letters. Instead, she'd found Kieran Holt, a man who said little, but whose actions spoke volumes, a man who defended her honor, who trusted her to help with his ranch, who looked at her like she was something precious and unexpected. 3 months, she'd said, but lying in the darkness, listening to the storm gradually exhaust itself, and hearing Kieran's restless movements in the room next door, Clara wondered if she'd already stayed too long or if 3 months wouldn't be nearly long enough. The rain continued through the night, gentler now, a steady patter on the roof that should have been soothing. But Clara lay awake acutely aware of the man on the other side of the wall, of the way her life had shifted in just 3 days from one path to another, entirely unexpected one. She thought about Gerald's threats about the cut fence, about the challenges that were surely coming. But she also thought about the women in town rallying around her, about Tom's approval, about the satisfaction of working alongside these tough, honest people who judged a person by their actions rather than their circumstances. And most of all, she thought about Kieran, about the walls he'd built around his heart, and the small cracks she could see forming in them. He'd been hurt, betrayed by a woman who'd chosen money and comfort over love and loyalty. Clara understood that fear, the reluctance to trust again after being burned. But she also understood that sometimes the greatest risks brought the greatest rewards. Sam and Dell had found their way to her new room and curled up on the quilt, their purrs a constant soothing sound. Outside, the storm was finally passing, moving on across the prairie toward the distant mountains. Clara could see stars beginning to appear through the breaking clouds, bright and clear as promises. Tomorrow was Sunday. She would go to church, face down any remaining gossip, establish herself as a respectable member of the community. And then Monday, she would continue the work of making the Double K Ranch House a home, of proving herself worthy of the trust Kieran had placed in her. But tonight in the darkness, with the storm passing, and the man she was beginning to care for just a wall away, Clara allowed herself to imagine a different future than the one she'd planned. Not a marriage of convenience to a man who saw her as property, but something deeper, truer, built on mutual respect and growing affection. It was a dangerous dream for a woman in her position, a housekeeper with nothing to offer but herself. But as Clara finally drifted towards sleep, she thought about Kieran's parents, a mail-order bride from Ireland, and a rancher who'd taken a chance on love across an ocean. Sometimes the most unlikely matches were the ones that lasted. The last thing she heard before sleep claimed her was Kieran's footsteps pausing outside her door as if he wanted to knock to say something more. But then they moved on, and Clara was left with only the sound of rain and possibility. The church bells were ringing as Clara descended the stairs. Sunday morning, dressed in her best remaining dress, a navy blue silk that had been her mother's, altered to fit her smaller frame. She'd spent extra time on her hair, pinning it into an elaborate twist that emphasized her neck and the delicate gold cross that was her only jewelry. If she was going to face the congregation of Silver Creek, she would do it with all the dignity she could muster. Kieran was waiting in the kitchen, dressed in clothes she'd never seen him wear, a proper black suit that must have been hanging in his wardrobe untouched for years. He looked uncomfortable in it, tugging at the collar as if it were strangling him. "You're coming to church?" Clara asked, unable to hide her surprise. "Figured you shouldn't face them alone," he said gruffly, not meeting her eyes. "Besides, the roof needs patching, and the minister's son is the best carpenter in town. Might be able to talk to him after the service." Clara knew an excuse when she heard one, but she didn't challenge it. The fact that Kieran was willing to enter a church for the first time in 3 years just to support her said more than any words could.
The ride to town was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence. The storm had washed the prairie clean, leaving everything sparkling in the morning sunlight. Water still stood in the low places, reflecting the sky like scattered mirrors, and the air smelled of sage and wet earth. "Thank you," Clara said suddenly, "for coming with me." "It's nothing," Kieran replied, but his hands tightened on the reins. "Just remember you don't owe anybody explanations. You're my housekeeper, that's all anyone needs to know." But was that all she was? After last night, after the things he'd said, the way he'd looked at her, Clara wanted to ask, but the words wouldn't come. This fragile thing building between them felt too new, too delicate to expose to the harsh light of day. The church was a simple white building with a modest steeple, the kind found in small towns across the frontier. As they pulled up, Clara could see people gathering their Sunday best, making a colorful display against the weathered wood. Conversation stopped as Kieran helped her down from the wagon, and Clara felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon them. "Chin up," Kieran murmured, offering her his arm. "You faced down a charging steer yesterday. This is nothing." Despite her nerves, Clara found herself smiling. The steer was less judgmental. "But probably smelled worse than Mrs. Henderson," he replied, and Clara had to stifle a laugh. They entered the church together, and Clara heard the ripple of whispers follow them down the aisle. Kieran led them to a pew near the middle, not so far forward as to seem presumptuous, not so far back as to seem ashamed. It was, Clara realized, exactly the right choice. Mrs. Morrison was already seated in the pew in front of them. She turned around with a grin that could only be described as wicked. "Well, well, Kieran Holt in church. Will wonders never cease?" "Mrs. Morrison," Kieran acknowledged stiffly. "And don't you both look fine this morning, almost like a properly courting couple?" The old woman's eyes twinkled with mischief. "We're not," Clara began, but Mrs. Morrison had already turned back around her shoulders, shaking with silent laughter. The minister, Reverend Douglas, was a tall, thin man with kind eyes and a voice that carried to every corner of the small church. His sermon was on the Good Samaritan, and Clara couldn't help but notice several pointed glances in their direction when he spoke about helping those in need regardless of circumstances. "We are called to be our brother's keeper," the Reverend intoned, "to offer aid without judgment, to show mercy as we hope to receive mercy." Clara felt Kieran shift beside her and glanced over to see his jaw clenched tight. She wanted to reach out to offer comfort, but such a display would only fuel more gossip. Instead, she simply shifted slightly closer, letting her shoulder brush against his arm. She felt him relax minutely at the contact. After the service, they were immediately surrounded. The minister's wife, Mrs. Douglas, whom Clara had met yesterday, took charge of introductions with the efficiency of a general deploying troops. "Clara, you must meet Mrs. Baker. She runs the school. And this is Mrs. Thompson. She organizes the church socials. Oh, and here's Miss Patterson. She teaches piano." Clara found herself swept into a circle of women, while Kieran was cornered by Reverend Douglas and several men, presumably about the roof repairs. She fielded questions with as much grace as she could manage, sticking to the simple truth she'd come west for opportunity. Mr. Holt had offered her honest work, and she was grateful for it. "And how are you finding ranch life?" Mrs. Baker asked. "It must be quite different from Boston." "Different, yes, but rewarding," Claire replied. "There's a satisfaction in hard work that I didn't expect." "She turned back cattle yesterday," Mrs. Morrison announced, having joined their circle. "Tom Rodriguez says she stood down a steer with nothing but a horse blanket and determination." The women made appropriately impressed sounds, and Clara felt herself being accepted slowly but surely into their community. These were strong women, she realized, women who'd faced their own challenges in this unforgiving land. They understood survival, understood making the best of unexpected circumstances. She was just beginning to relax when she heard a familiar, unwelcome voice. How touching! The fallen woman being embraced by the Christian ladies. Gerald Harrington stood at the edge of their circle, his pale eyes malicious. He was impeccably dressed as always, but Clara noticed his suit was beginning to show wear at the cuffs. Perhaps his financial situation wasn't as secure as he pretended. "Mr. Harrington," Mrs. Douglas said coolly, "I don't recall anyone falling except perhaps in your estimation, which we all know to be somewhat unreliable." A titter ran through the group of women, and Gerald's face flushed. "I'm simply concerned for the moral fabric of our community," he said stiffly. "When unmarried women live with unmarried men, I live in Mr. Holt's house as his employee, Clara interrupted, her voice carrying clearly through the churchyard, with locked doors between us and my conduct entirely proper, which is more than can be said for a man who brings a woman across the country under false pretenses and then abandons her because she doesn't meet his shallow standards. You were not what was advertised. Neither were you, Clara shot back. Your letter spoke of a kind Christian gentleman of means and character.
Instead, I found a petty, vindictive boy who cuts his neighbor's fences when he doesn't get his way. Gasps arose from the crowd that had gathered. The fence cutting was suspected, but had never been openly acknowledged. Gerald's face went from red to purple. You can't prove... Can't I? Kieran's voice cut through the crowd as he approached several men following him. Because I have Tom Rodriguez and 3 other witnesses who saw you riding away from my north pasture yesterday morning right before we discovered the damage. Circumstantial, Gerald sputtered. Maybe. But combined with the fact that you've been trying to force me to sell you water rights and that you threatened both Miss Whitmore and myself yesterday in front of witnesses at Henderson's store. Kieran shrugged. Well, folks can draw their own conclusions. The crowd was muttering now, and not in Gerald's favor. Clara saw him realize he was losing, saw the moment his bluster turned to something more dangerous.
You think you're so high and mighty, Holt, Gerald snarled. But I know things. I know your precious fiancée didn't just leave you for money. She left because she found out what kind of man you really are. Cold, controlling, incapable of giving a woman what she really needs. The crack of Kieran's fist against Gerald's jaw was like a gunshot in the quiet churchyard. Gerald went down hard, landing in a puddle left by last night's storm. He lay there stunned, muddy water, soaking his expensive suit. Get up, Kieran said quietly, but there was something dangerous in his voice. Get up and get out. If I catch you on my land again, if you come near Miss Whitmore again, if you so much as look at her wrong, I'll finish what I just started. Gerald scrambled to his feet, mud dripping from his clothes. This isn't over, he hissed, but the threat sounded hollow. He stumbled away, pushing through the crowd that parted to let him pass. There was a moment of absolute silence, then Mrs. Morrison started clapping. Slowly, others joined in until the entire churchyard was filled with applause. Kieran looked stunned, as if he couldn't quite process what was happening. Reverend Douglas stepped forward. Violence is never the answer, he said sternly, then his face softened. But sometimes a man must defend those under his protection. Mr. Holt. Miss Whitmore, you're both welcome in this church and this community. The crowd began to disperse, people returning to their normal Sunday routines, but not before many stopped to shake Kieran's hand or offer Clara words of support. By the time they made it back to the wagon, Clara felt emotionally wrung out. Your hand, she said, noticing Kieran flexing his fingers. It's fine. It's not fine, you probably broke something on Gerald's hard head. Let me see. She took his hand in both of hers, examining the scraped knuckles. They were already swelling, and she could see the beginning of bruises. We need to get ice on this, she said. Clara. His voice was soft, and she looked up to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have hit him. It just... When he said those things... They weren't true, Clara said firmly. Whatever Rebecca told him, whatever lies she spread to justify her betrayal, they weren't true. I've only known you a few days, Kieran, but I know you're a good man, an honorable man. His hand turned in hers, capturing her fingers. You barely know me. I know enough, Claire replied. I know you defended me when you didn't have to. I know you gave me work when I had nothing. I know you treat your employees fairly, care for your land responsibly, and honor your parents' memory. I know you came to church today, even though it was hard for you, just so I wouldn't be alone. What else do I need to know? He was quiet for a long moment, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. Rebecca said I was too distant, too wrapped up in the ranch to pay attention to her needs. Rebecca was a fool, Clara said bluntly. She wanted attention and pretty things more than she wanted a partner. That's not distance, Kieran. That's recognizing incompatibility. He laughed short and surprised. You don't mince words, do you? Would you prefer I didn't know? He said, and his hand tightened on hers. No, I wouldn't change a thing about you.
The ride home was quiet, but Clara kept sneaking glances at Kieran, noting the way the tension had eased from his shoulders. Standing up to Gerald publicly, having the community side with them, it had shifted something. The secret was out, the gossip addressed, and they'd survived it. When they reached the ranch, Tom was waiting on the porch with several other hands. "Boss, we've got trouble," Tom said without preamble. "That section of fence we fixed yesterday, it's down again, and this time whoever did it left something behind." He held up a silver cufflink monogrammed with the letters GH. Kieran took it, turning it over in his hand. "Gerald's getting sloppy, or maybe he wants us to know it's him." "What do we do?" one of the younger cowboys asked. "We can't keep fixing fence every day." "We set a watch," Kieran decided. 2 men every night, rotating shifts. Anyone comes near our fence, you fire a warning shot and sound the bell. The men nodded and dispersed to organize the watch. Clara followed Kieran inside, where he slumped into a kitchen chair, suddenly looking exhausted. "Let me see that hand properly now, sir," Clara ordered, filling a basin with cold water from the pump. He submitted to her ministrations without protest, hissing slightly when she cleaned the scraped knuckles. "You shouldn't have hit him," she said softly. "Not for me." "It wasn't just for you," Kieran admitted. "It was for me, too. I've wanted to hit Gerald Harrington for years, and when he brought Rebecca into it, used her to—" He shook his head. "I'm not proud of losing control, but I'm not sorry either." Clara wrapped his hand in a clean cloth, tying it off neatly. What did she really tell him, Rebecca? Kieran was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, the truth mostly. I did prioritize the ranch. I did work long hours. When my father got sick, I spent more time with him than with her. She wanted parties and trips to Denver, and I gave her cattle drives and account books. That's not a character flaw, Kieran. That's being responsible. Is it hiding behind work because it's easier than being vulnerable with another person? Clara considered this as she put away the medical supplies. Maybe both, she said finally, but the right person wouldn't ask you to choose. The right person would work alongside you. Understand that the ranch isn't just your job, but your heritage, your responsibility to your parents' memory. Like you have this week. The question hung in the air between them. Clara turned to find him watching her with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see straight through her. I'm just your housekeeper, she said, but the words sounded weak even to her. Are you? He stood moving closer. Because housekeepers don't usually help round up cattle. They don't stand up to men like Gerald in public. They don't. He reached out his good hand, touching her cheek gently. They don't make a man start thinking about the future again, instead of just surviving day to day. Kieran, she breathed, her heart racing. I know you said 3 months, he continued. I know you're planning to leave. But Clara, these past few days have been more alive than the last 3 years. You've brought something back to this place, something I thought was gone forever. What are you saying? I'm saying stay, not as my housekeeper. Stay as... He paused, struggling for words. I don't know what exactly. I just know that when I think about you leaving, it feels like losing sunlight. Clara's breath caught. I don't have anything to offer. No dowry, no connections, barely even proper clothes anymore. You have yourself, Kieran interrupted. Your strength, your pride, your refusal to back down. Christ, Clara, you stood down a charging steer with nothing but determination. You think I care about dowries. But 3 days... We've only known each other 3 days. My parents knew each other for 1 day before they decided, he reminded her. Sometimes you just know. Before Clara could respond, the bell at the barn started clanging frantically. They both rushed outside to see smoke rising from the direction of the north pasture. Fire! Tom was shouting, riding hard toward them. Harrington's men set the grass on fire. What followed was organized chaos. Every available hand grabbed wet burlap sacks, shovels, anything that could fight fire. Clara found herself working alongside the men, beating at the flames that threatened to consume the dry grass and spread to the buildings. The fire had been set strategically with the wind pushing it toward the ranch. But Kieran knew his land knew where the natural fire breaks were and deployed his men with military precision. Clara worked until her arms ached and her dress was ruined with soot and sweat, but she didn't stop. It was Maria Rodriguez who finally pulled her back. You've done enough, dear. Let the men finish it. Clara realized she was swaying on her feet, exhaustion hitting her all at once. Maria led her to the house, helped her wash the worst of the soot from her face and hands. You fought like you belonged here, Maria observed, like you were protecting your own land. It felt that way, Clara admitted. When I saw the smoke, all I could think was that they were trying to destroy Kieran's home, his heritage. And that mattered to you. Yes, Clara said simply. It mattered. By the time the fire was out, the sun was setting. The men trooped back exhausted but victorious. They'd contained the blaze, saved all the buildings, and most of the grazing land. But everyone knew this was escalation, that Gerald had moved from petty harassment to genuine danger. I'm writing to the sheriff tomorrow, Kieran announced to the assembled men. This has gone too far. Sheriff's in Gerald's pocket, Tom pointed out. Has been for years. Then I'll go to the territorial authorities. There has to be law somewhere. After the men dispersed, Clara found Kieran standing on the porch, staring at the blackened patch of land where the fire had burned. He won't stop, Kieran said quietly. Not until he gets what he wants, or destroys what he can't have. Then we stop him, Clara said firmly. You offered me a position, not as your housekeeper, but as something else, something more. I accept. Kieran turned to look at her, his face shadowed in the gathering darkness. Clara, you don't have to. I want to, she interrupted. I came west looking for a home, a partnership, a life with meaning. I found it just not where I expected. The question is, what exactly are you offering? He moved closer, his good hand coming up to frame her face. Everything, he said simply. Marriage, if you'll have me. Partnership in the ranch. A life that won't be easy, but will be ours. After 4 days, people will say we're crazy. Let them. When something's right, you know it. Clara thought about the woman she'd been just 4 days ago, stepping off that train with such hope and such misguided trust. That woman would have wanted time, propriety, careful consideration. But that woman hadn't fought fires, hadn't stood down charging cattle, hadn't seen what real partnership looked like. Yes, she said, and felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. Yes, I'll marry you. He kissed her then there on the porch, with the smell of smoke still in the air and the first stars beginning to appear. It wasn't the gentle, tentative kiss she might have expected, but something deeper, more desperate, as if he was trying to make up for 3 years of loneliness in a single moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara could see wonder in his eyes. I thought I was done with this, he said, with feeling anything beyond duty and responsibility. And I thought I was destined for a loveless business arrangement, Clara replied. Maybe we were both wrong. Or maybe we were both waiting for the right person to prove us wrong. They stood there holding each other as the night deepened around them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Gerald wouldn't give up easily, and there would be those who questioned the suddenness of their decision. But tonight, with Kieran's arms around her and the ranch they would protect together stretched out before them, Clara felt something she hadn't felt since before her parents died. She felt home. The sound of breaking glass shattered the moment. A rock came flying through the parlor window, a note tied to it. Kieran retrieved it, his face darkening as he read. What does it say? Clara asked. He handed it to her silently. In Gerald's pretentious handwriting, whores and thieves deserve each other. Enjoy your ranch while you can. Charming, Clara said dryly. He's taking rejection well. Despite the situation, Kieran laughed. You're not afraid of Gerald Harrington. Please, I've faced down scarier things than a spurned man-child with too much money and too little sense. Such as poverty, desperation, the prospect of a loveless future. She looked up at him. Gerald can throw all the rocks he wants. He can't touch what we're building here. Kieran pulled her closer. When did you become so fierce? Probably somewhere between the charging steer and the grass fire, Clara replied, although being publicly rejected might have contributed too. Best thing that ever happened to you, that rejection. Yes, Clara agreed, settling into his embrace. It absolutely was. They stayed on the porch despite the broken window, despite Gerald's threats, despite everything. The stars wheeled overhead, the prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, and somewhere in the distance a coyote sang to the moon. Clara had come west seeking one life and found another entirely one filled with challenge and danger. Yes, but also with purpose and unexpected love. "We should go inside," Kieran said eventually. "Board up that window." "In a moment," Clara replied. "I want to remember this. The night everything changed." "Everything changed 4 days ago," he corrected. "The moment you stepped off that train. For you too. Especially for me. I just didn't know it yet." They finally went inside and Kieran boarded up the broken window while Clara made coffee. They sat in the kitchen planning their next moves, the trip to the sheriff, the need for more security, the practical details of their sudden engagement. But underneath the logistics was something deeper, the recognition of two souls who had found each other against all odds. "We'll be married as soon as possible," Kieran said. "This week if the Reverend agrees, that'll stop any gossip about propriety. And Gerald's going to learn that some things can't be bought stolen or burned. This ranch, this life we're building, he can't touch it." Clara believed him. More than that, she believed in them, in this unexpected partnership forged in crisis and tempered by mutual respect. It wasn't the fairy tale she'd imagined as a girl, but it was real and solid, and theirs. As she climbed the stairs to her room, only one wall away from Kieran's for just a few more nights, Clara paused at the landing. Through the boarded window, she could see a sliver of prairie silver under moonlight. Somewhere out there, Gerald was probably plotting his next move. But here in this house that was becoming a home again, love was taking root despite the rocky soil. 3 months, she'd said. But sometimes life had other plans. Sometimes home found you when you least expected it in the last place you thought to look. Monday morning arrived with a crystalline clarity that made the previous night's violence seem like a bad dream, except for the boarded window in the parlor and the acrid smell of smoke that still lingered in the air. Clara woke before dawn, her mind already racing with everything that needed to be done. A wedding to plan, a ranch to protect, and Gerald Harrington to deal with, though not necessarily in that order. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Kieran already at the kitchen table studying a map of the property boundaries by lamplight. His injured hand was still wrapped, but he was using it to hold down one corner of the paper while making notes with the other. "You should be resting that hand," Clara said, moving to start the coffee. "Can't rest when Harrington's out there planning his next move." He looked up at her, and his expression softened. "Did you sleep at all?" "Some. You?" "Some." He stood crossing to where she worked at the stove. "Clara, about last night, what I asked you, if you've had second thoughts." She turned in his arms, silencing him with a finger to his lips. "No second thoughts, unless you're having them. Never." He caught her hand, pressing it to his chest where she could feel his heart beating strong and steady. "I meant every word. But I want to do this right. You deserve better than a rushed wedding because of gossip and threats." "What I deserve," Clara said firmly, "is a man who sees me as a partner, not a possession. A man who trusts me to stand beside him in trouble. That's you, Kieran. The rest is just details." He kissed her, then soft and sweet in the early morning kitchen, and Clara felt that rightness again, that sense of pieces falling into place. The moment was broken by Tom Rodriguez bursting through the back door. "Boss, we've got company coming. Looks like the sheriff and a couple of deputies." Kieran's expression darkened. So Gerald's making his move through legal channels now. Sheriff Watson was a thin, nervous man who perpetually looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Clara recognized him from town, though they'd never been introduced. He dismounted slowly, his deputies flanking him like bookends. "Morning, Kieran," the sheriff said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Miss Whitmore." "Sheriff, Kieran acknowledged coldly. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" "Had a complaint filed. Gerald Harrington says you assaulted him yesterday, in front of witnesses at the church." "After he publicly slandered Miss Whitmore and threatened us both," Kieran replied. "Also in front of witnesses." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Well, be that as it may, I need you to come to town, make a statement. You too, Miss Whitmore." Clara could see Kieran tensing, ready to fight, but she touched his arm gently. "We'll be happy to come, Sheriff. We have nothing to hide. In fact, we have some complaints of our own to file. Fence cutting, arson, vandalism. Now those are serious accusations. Yes, they are, Clara interrupted smoothly. And we have evidence, including Mr. Harrington's monogram cufflink found at the scene of the fence cutting and this threatening note he threw through our window last night. She produced the rock and note from her apron pocket, having had the foresight to retrieve them. The sheriff's face went pale. That is, Sheriff Watson, Kieran said, his voice dangerously quiet. You have a choice. You can continue being Harrington's puppet, or you can do your actual job. But know this, if you choose wrong, I'll be taking this to the territorial authorities, and they'll be very interested to know how you've been handling law enforcement in Silver Creek. The sheriff swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like a cork. I'll need to investigate all claims equally, he said finally. That means you still need to come to town. Fine, Kieran agreed, but we're bringing our own witnesses. An hour later, a procession headed to town, Kieran and Clara in the wagon, Tom Rodriguez and 3 other ranch hands on horseback, and Maria Rodriguez, who had appeared as if summoned by the drama, insisting she wouldn't miss this for anything. The sheriff's office was small and cramped, barely large enough for all the people who wanted to witness the proceedings. Gerald was already there, sporting a spectacular black eye and trying to look righteously indignant. There he is, Gerald pointed at Kieran. The man who assaulted me without provocation. Without provocation. Mrs. Morrison's voice rang out from the doorway. Boy, I was there, and you provoked plenty. Called Miss Whitmore terrible names, accused Mr. Holt of impropriety, and brought up that business with Rebecca just to be cruel. More townspeople pushed in, many of whom had witnessed the scene at church. The sheriff looked increasingly overwhelmed as testimony after testimony supported Kieran and Clara's version of events. He also threatened them at Henderson's store on Saturday, Mr. Henderson himself added, said he'd make them both regret crossing him. And everyone knows he's been after Kieran's water rights for years, another rancher contributed. Getting desperate about it too, what, with his streams drying up. Gerald's face was turning an interesting shade of purple. These are all lies. Holt has turned the whole town against me. No, Clara said quietly, but her voice carried. You turned the town against yourself with your petty cruelties and vindictive behavior. Mr. Holt simply defended my honor after you attempted to destroy it. Your honor? Gerald laughed nastily. What honor does a mail-order bride have? You came here to sell yourself to the highest bidder. The sound of Clara's palm connecting with Gerald's cheek echoed through the small office. The room went dead silent. That, Clara said calmly, was for insulting every woman who has ever had the courage to seek a better life, regardless of the means. Mail-order brides built half the Westminster Harrington. We're teachers, mothers, ranchers' wives, and pillars of communities. We're not commodities, and we're certainly not for sale. We're women who chose adventure over safety, uncertainty over resignation. And yes, we have honor more than a man who would bring a woman across the country only to humiliate her because she didn't match some impossible standard of perfection. The silence that followed was profound. Then Reverend Douglas, who had somehow squeezed into the packed office, began to clap. Others joined in, and soon the small space was filled with applause. Sheriff Watson cleared his throat. Right. Well, seems to me there's fault on both sides here. Mr. Holt, Mr. Harrington, I'm giving you both a warning about public brawling. Any more violence and there'll be consequences. He turned to Gerald. As for these other allegations, fence-cutting, arson, vandalism, those are serious charges that need investigating. You can't seriously be... Gerald started. I seriously am, the sheriff interrupted, seeming to find his backbone at last. There's evidence, Mr. Harrington. Your cufflink at the fence, multiple witnesses seeing you near the north pasture before the cutting, and this note in your handwriting. I'll need you to come back tomorrow for questioning. Gerald stood abruptly. This isn't over, he snarled, pushing his way through the crowd. After he left, the sheriff looked at Kieran apologetically. I should have done something sooner, but Harrington's got powerful friends, and I've got a family to feed. Just do your job from now on, Kieran said. That's all anyone asks. As they filed out of the sheriff's office, Clara found herself surrounded by well-wishers. Word of her speech had already begun to spread, and women she'd never met were shaking her hand, thanking her for standing up for all of them. "That was magnificent, dear," Mrs. Morrison crowed. "About time someone put that boy in his place, both with words and with action. That was a fine slap." Reverend Douglas approached them as the crowd dispersed. "Mr. Holt, Miss Whitmore, might I have a word?" They followed him to a quiet spot beside the church. "I heard," the Reverend said carefully, "that you might be in need of my services soon, for a wedding." Clara felt herself blush. Word traveled fast in Silver Creek. "Yes," Kieran said simply, "as soon as possible, if you're willing." The Reverend studied them for a moment. "It's quite sudden. You've known each other less than a week." "Sometimes a week is enough," Clara said. "Sometimes it's more than enough when you find the right person." "My parents knew each other one day," Kieran added. 40 years together after that." Reverend Douglas smiled. "I remember your parents well, Kieran. Your mother was indeed a mail-order bride from Ireland, wasn't she? And one of the finest women this town ever knew." He looked at Clara. "I see something of her spirit in you, Miss Whitmore. That same courage, that same refusal to be cowed by circumstances." "Thank you," Clara said softly. "Wednesday afternoon," the Reverend decided. 3 o'clock. That gives you 2 days to prepare, and it's soon enough to silence any remaining gossips about propriety. As they rode back to the ranch, Clara felt a mix of elation and terror. In 2 days, she would be married to a man she'd known less than a week. It was madness, perhaps, but it was a madness that felt more right than all the careful planning that had brought her to Silver Creek in the first place. "Wednesday," Kieran said, as if testing the word. "You could still change your mind." "So could you." "Not a chance." He reached over and took her hand. "Clara, I know this is happening fast, but I want you to know I'll be a good husband to you. I can't promise an easy life, but I promise you'll never doubt where you stand with me. You'll be my partner in everything." "That's all I ever wanted," Clara replied. "A true partnership." They spent the rest of Monday dealing with practical matters. Clara took inventory of what needed to be done to prepare for a wedding, however simple. She had no wedding dress, but her mother's blue silk would do. The house needed cleaning, food, needed preparing for whatever guests might come, and somehow word needed to be sent to those they wanted to attend. Maria took charge of spreading the news, declaring it the most romantic thing she'd ever heard. Rejected by one man on Thursday, proposed to by a better one on Sunday, married on Wednesday, it's like something from a novel. "A very dramatic novel," Clara agreed, scrubbing the kitchen floor with renewed vigor. She wanted everything perfect, or as perfect as possible given the circumstances. Tuesday brought unexpected visitors. First came Mrs. Douglas and several other women from town bearing gifts. Preserves linens, a lace tablecloth that had been Mrs. Douglas's own wedding gift years ago. Every bride needs something new, something old, something borrowed, and something blue. Mrs. Morrison announced, producing a small wrapped package. "This is the old." Inside was a beautiful silver hair comb, intricate and delicate. "It was my mother's," the elderly woman explained. "Came with her from Pennsylvania in 1845. I have no daughters to pass it to, and you remind me of her, tough as nails when needed, soft as silk when it mattered." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "I couldn't possibly—" "You certainly could, and will. Consider it my wedding gift." The other women had brought their own contributions: a new handkerchief with embroidered edges, a borrowed veil that had been used by 3 other Silver Creek brides, and blue ribbon for her bouquet. "What bouquet?" Clara asked. "Everything's still barely green from winter." "Leave that to us," Mrs. Baker said mysteriously. The second unexpected visitor came that afternoon. Clara was in the parlor, trying to repair the window temporarily with oiled paper until glass could be ordered from Denver, when she heard horses approaching, many horses. She went to the door to find at least a dozen men dismounting, all ranchers from the surrounding area. They were led by an older man with a magnificent gray beard and eyes like chips of flint. "Miss Whitmore," he said, removing his hat. "I'm Samuel Crenshaw. I own the Triple C Ranch to the south. We're here to speak with Kieran." Kieran emerged from the barn wariness in every line of his body. "Sam, what's this about?" "It's about Gerald Harrington," Crenshaw said bluntly. "Boy's been a plague on this valley for too long. Going after you and your future bride was the last straw. We've come to offer our support. We're forming an association, another rancher explained, for mutual protection and support. Harrington's been trying to play us against each other for years, but if we stand together, he can't fight all of us, Kieran finished. You're proposing an alliance. More than that, Crenshaw said. We're proposing to run him out of the valley entirely. Boy inherited good land and ruined it with his greed and incompetence. His ranch is mortgaged to the hilt I have, that from the bank manager himself. One more bad season and he'll be foreclosed on. And we can make sure it's a bad season, another man added grimly. No one sells to him, no one buys from him. Complete isolation. Clara watched Kieran consider this. She could see him weighing justice against mercy, pragmatism against principle. No violence, he said finally. We do this legal and proper, but yes, I'm in. The men nodded, shaking hands all around. Before they left, Crenshaw turned to Clara. Ma'am, I knew Kieran's mother well. You remind me of her that same steel spine. She'd be proud to see her son marrying a woman of character. After they left, Clara found Kieran standing on the porch, staring out at the land that had been in his family for 30 years. Are you all right? She asked, joining him. It's strange, he said. For 3 years I've kept to myself avoided entanglements connections. Now in less than a week I'm getting married and joining a ranchers association. Regrets? He turned to her, pulling her against him. Never. You've brought me back to life, Clara. Not just me, this whole place. Look at it. She did look, seeing the ranch through his eyes. The house gleamed with care smoke, rose cheerfully from the chimney, the kittens played in the yard, and ranch hands went about their work with new energy. It did look more alive, more like a home than just a place of business. We did this together, she said. It wasn't just me. No, it was you, your courage, your refusal to accept defeat. You stood up to Gerald when I was ready to just endure his harassment. You made me remember that some things are worth fighting for. That evening, as Clara prepared dinner, she found herself humming. It was an old song her mother used to sing, something about home and hearth and love that endures. She hadn't hummed in years, not since before her father's business failed, before her world collapsed. You sound happy, Kieran observed, entering the kitchen. I am happy, Clara realized with some surprise. Despite everything, Gerald's threats, the rushed wedding, the uncertainty of it all, I'm happy. Good, he said, moving behind her to wrap his arms around her waist. Because I want to make you happy, Clara, every day for the rest of our lives. She leaned back against him, feeling the solid strength of him, the safety of his embrace. Tomorrow she would marry this man, would bind her life to his and to this land that was beginning to feel like home. It should have been terrifying, but instead it felt like the most natural thing in the world. That night, their last night as unmarried people, they sat in the parlor talking until late. Not about anything profound, just small things, learning each other's rhythms and preferences. Kieran liked his coffee black, but his tea with honey. Clara couldn't sleep without a window cracked open, even in winter. He'd broken his nose in a riding accident at age 12. She'd once sewn a dress for the governor's wife in Boston. Tell me about your parents, Clara said. What were they like together? Kieran's face softened with memory. They were partners in the truest sense. Pa would consult Ma on every major decision, and she'd give her opinion straight, no sugarcoating. They'd argue sometimes. Lord, could they argue, but they never went to bed angry. Ma used to say that love wasn't just a feeling. It was a choice you made every day, especially on the days when you didn't feel like making it. She sounds wise. She was. And tough. First winter here, they lived in a soddy while building this house, lost their first crop to hail their second to drought, but they persevered, built something lasting. He looked at Clara. That's what I want for us, to build something lasting. Even though we're starting with threats and violence and Gerald Harrington trying to destroy us, maybe especially because of that, nothing worth having comes easy. He paused. Clara, there's something I need to tell you. About Rebecca, about what Gerald said. You don't owe me explanations about your past. I want you to know, he interrupted. Rebecca left me for money, yes, but also because I couldn't give her what she needed emotionally. I was so focused on the ranch, on taking care of my sick father, that I neglected her. She was wrong to cheat, but I wasn't blameless. Clara considered this. Were you in love with her? I thought I was, but looking back, I think I was in love with the idea of her of having a wife starting a family. I never really knew her, not the way I already feel I know you. After less than a week. Time doesn't determine depth, Kieran said. I've learned more about your character in 5 days than I learned about Rebecca's in 2 years. You show yourself in your actions, Clara. Every choice you make reveals who you are. And who am I? She asked, genuinely curious about his perception. You're brave without being reckless, proud without being vain, kind without being weak. You're someone who sees what needs doing and does it. Whether that's standing up to a bully or fighting a fire or turning a house back into a home. He reached over and took her hand. You're the woman I want to spend my life with. Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks. No one had ever seen her so clearly, valued her so completely for exactly who she was. I should go to bed, she said, though she didn't want the evening to end. Big day tomorrow. The biggest, he agreed, standing and pulling her to her feet. For a moment they stood close, his hands on her waist, hers on his chest. After tomorrow, everything changes, Clara said softly. No, Kieran corrected. After tomorrow, everything that's already changed becomes official. He kissed her gently, a promise of tomorrow and all the tomorrows after. Then with visible effort, he stepped back. Good night, Clara. Sleep well. Good night, Kieran. But Clara didn't sleep well. She lay awake thinking about the journey that had brought her here, the strange twists of fate that had turned rejection into opportunity, humiliation into triumph. In the morning, she would put on her mother's dress and marry a man she'd known less than a week, and somehow that felt more right than all the careful plans she'd made before. Through her window, she could see stars wheeling overhead, the same stars she'd watched from the train just days ago when she'd been heading toward a different life entirely. Fate, her mother used to say, had a sense of humor. Clara was beginning to believe she was right. Tomorrow, she would become Clara Holt. The mail-order bride who wasn't marrying the man who hadn't advertised for a wife, but had found one anyway. It was absurd and romantic and terrifying and perfect all at once. She finally drifted off to sleep just before dawn, her dreams filled with prairie grass and storm-gray eyes, and a future that stretched out before her like an unwritten story waiting to be told. Wednesday dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself had decided to bless their union. Clara woke to find Maria Rodriguez already in the kitchen, commandeering preparations with military efficiency. The bride shouldn't have to cook on her wedding day, Maria declared, shooing Clara away from the stove. Go make yourself beautiful. Not that you need much help in that department. Clara bathed and dressed carefully in her mother's blue silk, now cleaned and pressed to perfection. The other women arrived soon after Mrs. Morrison, with the silver comb Mrs. Douglas, with the borrowed veil Mrs. Baker, with an absolutely stunning bouquet of wildflowers and sage that she'd somehow procured despite the season. You look perfect, Mrs. Morrison declared, stepping back to admire their handiwork. That Gerald Harrington must be kicking himself right about now. I doubt Mr. Harrington thinks about anything but himself, Clara replied. But she was smiling. She did look beautiful, she realized, catching sight of herself in the mirror, not because of the dress or the veil, but because she was glowing with happiness from within. The church was packed when they arrived. It seemed the entire town had turned out, cramming into pews and standing along the walls. Clara saw the ranchers who'd pledged their support, the townspeople who'd witnessed her confrontations with Gerald, and many faces she didn't recognize but who'd apparently come to see the mail-order bride who'd caused such a sensation marry the rancher who'd defended her. But Clara had eyes only for Kieran standing at the altar in his black suit, looking nervous and handsome and absolutely perfect. When their eyes met, his face transformed with a smile that made her heart skip. Tom Rodriguez walked her down the aisle, having volunteered for the honor with gruff sentimentality. You saved this ranch, he whispered as they walked. Brought it back to life. Brought him back to life. The ceremony was simple but beautiful. Reverend Douglas spoke about love finding a way, about courage in the face of adversity, about partnerships that could weather any storm. When he asked if anyone objected, there was a tense moment of silence, everyone half expecting Gerald to burst in with some dramatic protest. But the moment passed peacefully, and Clara released a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "Do you, Kieran, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Douglas asked.
"I do," Kieran said, his voice strong and certain. "Do you, Clara, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Clara said, meaning it with every fiber of her being.
"Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, appropriate for the public setting, but Clara felt the promise in it, the passion held in check, the future stretching before them. The church erupted in cheers and applause. As they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Clara saw faces beaming with genuine happiness for them. Even Sheriff Watson was there, looking slightly shamefaced, but applauding nonetheless. The reception was held at the ranch transformed for the occasion. Tables had been set up in the yard, laden with food contributed by what seemed like every woman in the valley. Musicians had appeared from somewhere, and soon fiddle music filled the air. "Did you arrange all this?" Clara asked Maria, overwhelmed by the generosity. "Honey, this town's been waiting for something to celebrate for years. You and Kieran just gave us an excuse." As the sun set, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Clara found herself in Kieran's arms for their first dance as husband and wife. Neither was particularly graceful, but it didn't matter. They swayed together, lost in each other, while their guests clapped and cheered. "No regrets," Kieran murmured in her ear. "Never," Clara replied. "This is exactly where I'm meant to be."